When the Nazis designed their eugenics program to sterilize and abort those they deemed inferior or undesirable, they looked to one nation as their example: the United States of America. For decades, the United States was a world leader in applying eugenics to its own population. Politicians passed laws to prevent entire races from entering the country. Universities taught their students the benefits of selective human breeding. And activists were hailed as heroes for calling for the sterilization of the poor, sick, and mentally ill. Today, on A Day in History, we'll look at the rise of the eugenics movement in the US, what it believed, who promoted it, and the consequences that so many innocent people suffered before it was wiped away. Eugenics, meaning good genes, was a movement that hoped to improve the genetic health of humanity by promoting the breeding of good or desirable people while limiting or preventing that of undesirables. It is a scientific fact that genes can influence the physical health and that certain conditions can be passed between parent and child. However, genetics was still in its infancy when eugenics emerged, and many false beliefs became embedded in the movement. Behavioral genetics, a field coined by Francis Galton in the 1880s, believed that a range of behaviors, including criminality and alcoholism, were also genetic, and this became accepted wisdom among eugenicists. A number of other negative traits, such as mental health issues, were also attributed to bad genes. Galton was actually a cousin of Charles Darwin, and the eugenicists were quick to apply Darwin's evolutionary theory and survival of the fittest idea to humanity. Eugenicists believe that society should weed out the sick, ill, poor, and those deemed inferior and try to ensure only those with good genes reproduced. Inevitably, eugenics became deeply associated with racism. From the outset, Galton and early eugenicists assumed the innate superiority of Northern Europeans. Those of Nordic, Germanic, or Anglo-Saxon heritage were believed to be genetically superior in terms of intelligence, morality, and physical prowess, with other races spread out on a scale far below them. It followed that breeding between the superior races and the inferior ones was to be avoided. That superior races should be encouraged to breed among themselves as much as possible, and that the inferior races have their numbers limited as much as possible. Not all eugenics was race-based. Black eugenicists rejected the racist conclusion of some eugenicists but still targeted the physically, mentally, and morally unfit within the black community. This included Thomas Wyatt Turner, the first black American to receive a PhD, and W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the greatest intellectuals of his day, who famously argued that, quote, only fit blacks should procreate to eradicate the race's heritage of moral iniquity. Also fundamental to the American eugenics movement was the work of English sociologist Thomas Malthus. Malthus presented dire theories on the apocalyptic consequences of overpopulation that he believed would cause global catastrophe in the near future. Malthusian theory argued that the population was growing too fast and would soon overtake society's ability to sustain that population, leading to mass death, famine, and chaos. Malthus and his supporters called for a culling of the population and strict controls on breeding that naturally aligned with the eugenics movement. Writing in his famous essay on population, Malthus wrote that, quote, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. He even recommended that society should court the return of the plague to keep population down. Time would prove Malthus's theories wrong, but in the early 20th century they were accepted as fact by most intellectuals and political elites. It was popular with the progressive and had supporters on both the political left and right, with its opponents denounced as anti-science or enemies of social progress. This combined belief in behavioral genetics, racial inferiority, and an imminent population crisis explain why eugenics has such a strong appeal in this period. This mix of eugenics, racism, and Malthusian theory dominated American society for much of the late 19th and early 20th century. The influence of eugenics can be seen in the explosion of pro-eugenic society and education in America in the early 1900s. In 1906, John Harvey Kellogg, more famous today for cornflakes, founded the Race Betterment Foundation to push for eugenics. 1910 saw the founding of the Eugenics Record Office by Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin, which would play a major role in pushing for eugenics policies around the United States. Then in 1918, the Galton Society consolidated eugenicist intellectuals to publish a newsletter promoting recent discoveries and arguments in the eugenics field. Eugenics was entrenched in the education system too. From 1914, major universities like Harvard and Columbia began offering courses on it. The National Education Association set up a committee on racial well-being to integrate eugenics into education more broadly and encourage people to think in terms of eugenics across all subjects. By 1928, there were almost 400 eugenics courses available at U.S. colleges, and the vast majority of American high schools taught their children about it. Racist eugenics was easy to apply into America. Racist attitudes were widespread, and there were already official and unofficial limitations of interracial relationships and breeding. Miscegenation laws barring marriage between whites and non-whites had existed in America since at least the 17th century. The one-drop rule for American racial categorization meant that the children of mixed-race marriages were automatically considered to be members of the lesser race. Miscegenation laws like Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act were the direct result of pressure from eugenics advocates who argued that interracial marriage posed a threat to the racial and genetic health of America. The Virginia law was typical of such statutes, making marriages between white and non-white marriages totally illegal in the state. Eugenics manifested in law through immigration restrictions as well. As a general rule, immigrations from countries deemed superior, those being Western and Northern Europe, was privileged, while immigration from other areas like Eastern Europe or Asia faced heavy restrictions. While economic, social, and cultural concerns also shaped immigration policy, eugenicist concerns about the racial health of the US were definitely a factor. For example, in 1917, the US implemented literacy tests to filter out the intellectually defective from the immigration numbers. These laws were supported and formulated by eugenicists. The high point of eugenics-informed immigration law was the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. This act placed strict quotas on immigration, offering larger quotas for preferred races and lower quotas for less preferred ones. This was far from America's first race-based immigration law. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, had totally banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. But the 1924 law was the most significant so far. Under the law, immigration from outside the Americas was limited to just over 160,000 per year, with over 90% of that restricted only to European nations. Just 2,500 immigrants were to be allowed from Asia and Africa combined. Japanese immigrants were all but banned, which caused a significant downturn in US-Japanese relations. The 1924 immigration law was popular by all measures with the American people. With fears of a mass exodus from war-torn Europe about the First World War and that communist subversives would be among them, the 1924 law gave many a sense of security. Sterilization was also a high priority for eugenicists. Indiana kick-started the trend of sterilization laws for undesirables, including asylum patients and criminals in 1907. 32 states would pass similar laws over the following years. By far, the most extensive was in California, where some 20,000 people were sterilized before it was repealed. As a result, the number of sterilizations in the US tripled between 1904 and 1921, mostly applying to criminals, mentally ill patients, and minorities. In 1927, the Supreme Court upheld Virginia's compulsory sterilization law in the case of Buck v. Bell, arguing that sterilization of mental asylum patients were permitted under the Constitution, as these people were deemed contrary to the protection and health of the state. The case started when then 18-year-old Carrie Buck, who had been committed to an asylum in Virginia because of prostitution and drug use, along with a medical classification of moron or below normal intelligence. She had also become pregnant as a teen, possibly due to rape. The court opinion decided that her welfare and that of society will be promoted by her sterilization. Carrie was forcibly sterilized shortly after, but was eventually released and lived until 1983. She went on to have a fairly normal life, and her family and friends never noticed any signs of the mental deficiencies that the asylum doctors had believed were so bad that she had to be removed from the gene pool. Even when sterilization was not mandatory, it was often encouraged or incentivized towards poor, mostly non-white women. Doctors were known to lie to patients about the sterilization being reversible. Other women reported being threatened with reduced or removed welfare payments unless they were sterilized. Reports of this nature continue into the 1970s in some southern states, mostly for black women. In Puerto Rico, as many as 1/3 of all women were sterilized between the 1930s and 1970s to try to control the population there, and as many as 40% of all Native American women were sterilized in the first half of the 1970s. Sterilization laws remained in place for decades, only fading out slowly as eugenics lost ground. Although the Supreme Court ruled in Skinner v. Oklahoma in 1942 that compulsory sterilization of criminals was unconstitutional, other forms were still commonplace long afterwards. An estimated 60,000 to 70,000 people were forcibly sterilized under American eugenics laws, and many more underwent procedures with dubious consent. While men were sometimes sterilized, the vast majority of these were performed on women. Forced sterilization gradually lost support after the 1940s, but it clung on for a while through the advocacy of men like Clarence Gamble. In 1947, Gamble, heir to the Procter & Gamble soap company, funneled his wealth into the Human Betterment League of North Carolina to advocate sterilization of minorities and the poor who placed a larger burden on state welfare. Similar groups emerged in other states, and it wasn't until 1977 that North Carolina ended the sterilization policies that his group advocated for. But there is no figure in the American eugenics movement whose legacy is as powerful or as complicated as that of Margaret Sanger. Born in 1879, Sanger would become one of the most famous women of her day through her advocacy of birth control and abortion. In 1916, she formed what is known today as Planned Parenthood, which is the leading abortion provider in the United States. What one thinks of abortion or Planned Parenthood will determine one's opinion of Sanger herself. However, it is undeniable that Sanger's life and work was rooted in an absolute commitment to eugenics and her desire to turn what she called the American race into one of physical perfection, mental strength, and spiritual progress. Sanger was a political radical who ran in various socialist, communist, and anarchistic circles during her time in New York. There she began promoting alternative views of sexuality, such as free love, which led to her being charged with promoting indecency and obscenity. Sanger then fled to England in 1914, where she encountered Malthusian theory and became immersed in the eugenics movement, thriving among the country's intellectuals. After making connections with leading figures in England's eugenics movement, Sanger returned to the US, where she used eugenics arguments to push for birth control and abortion. For example, she had a long list of those whom she considered to be unfit for breeding, including those suffering from tuberculosis, sexually transmitted diseases, cancer, epilepsy, mental health disorders, and even alcoholism. Eugenicists held that these problems were related to a person's genes and that children of such parents would inevitably reproduce their problems. Allowing children of these people to be born, in Sanger's words, places upon the community the burden of caring for it and probably for its defective descendants for many generations. Sanger's approach to eugenics was informed by her prior socialist learnings and shows how eugenicist thinking could work its way into almost any part of social, economic, or political life. She considered eugenics to be a tool of working class power and a means to improve workers' rights. In her 1920 book, Women and the New Race, Sanger wrote, "The way to get bigger wages, shorter hours, a new system for the advancement of labor is to make labor's numbers fewer. Let's not wait for war, famine, and plague to do it. Let us cease bringing unwanted children into the world to suffer a while, add to our burdens and die. Let us cease bringing others into the world to compete with us for a living." Sanger's views went further. expressing hostility to charity and welfare that allowed the poor and sick to reproduce. Writing in her later 1950 book, The Pivot of Civilization, she denounced charity as the surest sign that our civilization had bred, is breeding, and is perpetuating constantly increasing numbers of defectives, delinquents, and dependents, who she considered to be the full harvest of human waste. Sterilization and segregation were on the cards for Sanger. She called for those deemed unfit for breeding, especially of the moron class, should be segregated during the reproductive period. But Sanger went on, "We prefer the policy of immediate sterilization, of making sure that parenthood is absolutely prohibited to the feeble-minded." Feeble-minded was a loose term that could mean anyone suffering from any perceived mental deficiency, ranging from genuine mental disability to depression or anxiety. Given the close ties between eugenics and racism, Sanger's actions on matters of race are also concerning. Sanger set up her first ever abortion clinic in a mostly Jewish and Slavic neighborhood of Brooklyn, two racial groups considered inferior and defective by racist eugenicists. It was shut down in just 2 weeks, but the fact that she identified minority communities and most needing population control had raised eyebrows. Her magazine, Birth Control Review, regularly published openly racist articles on eugenics, such as Lothrop Stoddard's The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which argued that the world's white countries were facing an existential threat through genetic mixing with non-whites. Perhaps the most damning association Sanger had with openly racist eugenicists was the magazine's publication of Ernst Rudin's Eugenic Sterilization, An Urgent Need in 1933. Rudin was a vocal German eugenicist who played a crucial role in Nazi Germany's eugenics policy. Rudin was given multiple awards by the regime for his work and was described by Hitler himself as the pioneer of the racial hygienic measures of the Third Reich. In 1939, Sanger established the Negro Project to control high black birth rates in the South. This controversial program actually had the support of many black intellectuals, such as Du Bois, who had penned an article for Birth Control Review in 1932 supporting eugenics among the black population. While rejecting white supremacist notions of superior and inferior races, Du Bois and other black eugenicists agreed that bad genes leading to various physical, mental, and societal ills could be eliminated, and that reducing the population of undesirables would be better for the black community. It does not appear that Sanger was intending to limit the southern black population on the basis of race, although the impression that she was doing that certainly existed. There was plenty of black opposition to her work, as well as the usual opponents to her work on birth control and abortion. Sanger seemed to have genuinely believed that eugenics could help the black population, but she was aware that it might not appear that way. "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population," she wrote in one report, and urged that black community leaders participate in the project to make it easier to reach out to black communities. The project collapsed in 1942, having failed to make much of an impact. (1942) marked a major shift in eugenics in the US. With America's entry in the Second World War, eugenics became deeply associated with Hitler and the Nazis, so American eugenicists scrambled to distance themselves from Germany's ideas and rebranded themselves under other names, while the scientific consensus shifted overwhelmingly against eugenics in the post-war years. The fact that America had not pursued euthanasia or mass extermination of those considered unfit for breeding, unlike Germany, was a useful way for American eugenicists to distance themselves from the Nazis, despite the racism, sterilization, and other aspects they shared. Eugenics thinking and its conclusions did not vanish overnight. Many racists maintained a belief in racial eugenics well into the second half of the 20th century. Sanger and Planned Parenthood shed the explicit eugenics language and rebranded purely as birth control and abortion activists, pivoting away from talking about limiting the sterilization or elimination of defectives and the feeble-minded to emphasize family planning and voluntary abortion. Sterilization of criminals was ended in 1942 with Skinner versus Oklahoma, but it wasn't until 1978 that laws were put in place nationwide to control compulsory or coerced sterilization. In 1967, the appropriately named Loving v. Virginia case saw the Supreme Court strike down laws banning interracial marriage. Of course, how one views abortion will decide whether you think eugenics has been eliminated on that front too or is alive and well in the United States. Pro-lifers will argue that the overwhelmingly majority of abortions are still performed on the poor and minorities, the same groups the eugenicists wanted to be controlled in the first place, and in practice abortion is still achieving its ends. Pro-choicers will argue that modern abortion and family planning is free of the coercion and sinister motives of eugenics and is an entirely voluntary exercise of women's rights. At the very least, the pseudoscience of eugenics is discredited and many of its worst results, including forced sterilization and bans on interracial marriage, are long gone. But it still casts a shadow over the history and politics of the United States of America.